I remember a long time ago, I'm not going to say how long, back when I was in the 8th grade in Orono, Maine, our school began what was at that time quite new and experimental, teaching conversational French to junior high students. Because the University of Maine was in Orono, we had access to lots of students who wanted to be teachers. So one of them came to our class 2 or 3 times a week to teach us conversational French. At least at that time in Maine, with its Franco-American population, French was the language of choice, the default language, rather than Spanish. Although I later took 4 years of high school French in Massachusetts, the thing that always comes to me when I begin to think in French is one of the conversations I learned back in 8th grade in Orono. It goes like this. Allô, Passy 25? Oui, qui est à l'appareil? Ici Pierre, Bernard est là. Il vient d'arriver, je te la passe. Got that? The mother answers, and the young man who's calling says, is this Passy Vanderkans, Passy 2215? And she says, yes, who's on the phone? And he says, ici Pierre, Bernard est là. This is Pierre, is Bernard there? She said, oh, sure, I'll pass him the phone. I can't remember the rest of the conversation between Pierre and Bernard, but that's the part that I do remember. Okay, so it's true confessions time, and you do not need to raise your hands. It's between you and God, but how often when you call someone on the phone do you say, instead of saying, ici Pierre, you just start talking? Forget to say who you are. How many times have you answered the phone and somebody starts talking and you think, who is this? And it takes about 3 or 4 back and forths before you figure it out, but you're a little nervous to ask, right? In our gospel today, Jesus said that his own followers could recognize his voice, that they could divide the trustworthy from the untrustworthy by the sound of the voice. They're like sheep who will not follow a stranger because they don't know the stranger's voice. The sheep know the voice of their shepherd, and they will follow only him. Because they belong to Jesus, who is the good shepherd, his followers respond faithfully to the sound of his voice. What is it about a voice that signals us to trust it? Actually, I have to say that I found it really ironic to be doing this sermon about Jesus' voice this week when I spent 3 days with laryngitis. My voice didn't sound like my voice, right? What is there about Jesus' voice that beckons us to follow him? The world is so cluttered with voices competing for our attention. A cacophony of voices shouting out for loyalty, urging us to get in step, to join the followers of this cause or that cause, to give to this cause or that cause. You don't have to spend much time on the TV news or even on Facebook. You don't have to get too many appeals for different monies in the mail to get a bit overwhelmed by all the different voices clamoring for our attention. Sometimes Jesus' voice may be heard above these clamoring voices, and sometimes it can even be heard in them. But Jesus' claim is that his followers will know his voice, surely know it, when they hear it. And that they'll be able to distinguish his true and clear call from the false tones of strangers. What is it that makes that so? How can we be sure that it's Jesus' voice that we're hearing? What makes a person able to unmistakably recognize the voice of Jesus? As I said to the kids this morning, I believe that part of that is familiarity. As we saw, sometimes it's hard to hear the voice of their loved one in the midst of the cacophony. But it's true that a child will brighten and smile and turn at the voice of a beloved one or a parent. A trusted voice, a familiar voice. And even for us, when an old friend calls on the phone out of nowhere, there's a flicker. Is that really you? How many years has it been? It's great to hear from you. You know, I recognize your voice anywhere. So how is it that we can become familiar with the voice of Jesus? As with any dear friend, we begin by spending time with him. Spending time, worshiping him with other people of faith, joining in fellowship with other Christians, studying the Word of God, reading devotionals, meditating and praying, pausing to think about the Word together, Bible studies together. We keep our eyes open to see him at work in our world. We listen for his voice in times of distress and of pain. We listen for his voice in those times when we're not sure that we can take even one more step. We can hear his voice speaking comfort to us in those times. Peace, peace I leave with you. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. Many times when our faith falters, he reassures us again, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. When we are uncertain of the purpose of life and confused about what makes life good and true, Jesus calls us with a voice that rings true. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. The heart of the matter. The gospel tells us that Jesus calls his sheep by name and leads them out. The voice of Jesus speaks to each one of us personally, but not just personally, also commandingly. Jesus is not a voice that's spoken over the public address system, making a vague general announcement for the whole world to hear. The voice of Jesus speaks to us lovingly, calling out our name, summoning us by name, each and every person being summoned to follow. And when we hear his voice, fellow disciples of Christ, we follow. We do not need to respond to the bitter, judgmental, hate-filled, and strife-torn voices of strangers around us. We can listen and hear and follow the voice of Jesus calling to us above that din. Eva Watts told a story of traveling with a friend through the country where Jesus lived. She said, we reached a high ridge overlooking the village of Bethlehem. There we found a sheepfold and went right in to inspect. It was not long before the owner appeared, a veteran. We thought him as like Moses with a long beard. My friend asked, is this your sheepfold? And he said, aye. And is this where the sheep sleep? Pointing to a rough shelter thrown up against a rock in a corner. He nodded. And she said, but you've got no gate to the fold. How do you close them up at night? She said, the old man looked at us as if we ought to have known better. I am the door, he said with emphasis. And gathering his loose robe tight about his ankles, he was down in a moment, squatting in the doorway, back against one post, feet against the other, his knees drawn up and clasped by his weather-beaten old hands. Gently he bowed his head and closed his eyes, as he had surely done many times, to catch a few hours' sleep under the starlight. I am the door, he repeated. I keep watch here at night. If thieves or wild beasts attempt to enter, they have to tackle me first. I've never lost a lamb from the fold yet. I am the door. Life is really about choosing the right door, making sure that we choose the right door. Doors represent separation, because you're either on the inside of the door looking out or on the outside of the door looking in. If you are on the outside looking in, I encourage you today to open that door, which is Jesus Christ, to walk in to the only life worth living. And if you're on the inside looking out, I encourage you to invite as many people as you can to join you to walk through the door that you have taken as well. For when we take him up on his offer, Jesus grants access and guidance to a rich pasture for the sheep. As the door, Jesus grants access to a richer life that God makes available to us by grace. Jesus wants his sheep to be safe and full, to have an abundant life. Not things in abundance, but life in abundance. The better that we know the shepherd, the better that we see Jesus as the model for our lives as Christians, and the better that we can follow him. One thing that brought that sharply into view more than a century ago was a novel by Charles Sheldon titled In His Steps. How many have read that book? Beautiful, beautiful book. The subtitle has been used in many ways since then. What Would Jesus Do? How many have heard that? Sheldon's book was written in 1897, and it became a blockbuster, selling over 8 million copies. It's never really gone out of print since. In 2013, the story was told in a movie. Now it's even available as an ebook. It's keeping up with the times. In His Steps tells the story of what happened in the lives of members of a church after they committed themselves to approach the decisions in their workplaces and in other arenas of their lives by asking first what Jesus would do, and then trying to do that. The results were life-changing for the members of that congregation and also for their whole community. That was only a story, of course, but the spark for it came from the author's personal experience. At the time he wrote the book, he was a minister in Topeka, Kansas. But before that, he'd been a social worker. And as an experiment, he disguised himself one day as an unemployed printer. He then walked the streets of Topeka to see what would happen. What he discovered was indifference, apathy, among many professing Christians toward those in need. That shocked and saddened him, but it also led him to just imagine how different the world would be if Christians did not compartmentalize our lives, but instead allowed Christianity to be equally applied to all situations. And so the book, In His Steps, was the ultimate result. The real subject of this passage in John is about following Jesus for real. It means learning to listen to his voice and then bounding after him like sheep who hear and know the merciful voice of the Good Shepherd. It means looking at how he lived his life and what he said as it's recorded in the Bible, and then trying to live our lives in the same way, the way of love. So my friends, let's not merely talk about Jesus. Let's not merely admire Jesus. Let's do all that we can to bound like sheep and follow him, one day at a time. That's the heart of the matter. And then not only will our cup runneth over, but our hearts will be overflowing with love. Thanks be to God.